So there's a man crawling through the desert. He decided to try his SUV for a little bit of cross country travel. He had fun zooming over the Badlands, through the sand, got lost, and hit a big rock, and then he couldn't get it started again. There were no cell phone towers anywhere near, so his cell phone was useless. He had no family. His parents had died a few years before in an auto accident, and his few friends had no idea where he was or that he was even out here. He stayed with the car for a day or so, but his one bottle of water ran out, and he was getting thirsty. He thought maybe he knew the direction back. Now that he'd paid attention to the sun, he'd figured out which way was north, so he decided to start walking. He figured he'd only have to go about 30 miles or so, and he'd be back to the small town he'd gotten gas in last. He thinks about walking at night to avoid the heat and sun, but based upon how dark it actually was the night before, and given that he has no flashlight, he's afraid that he'll break a leg or step on a rattlesnake. So he puts on some sunblock, puts the rest in his pocket for reapplication later, brings an umbrella he had in the back of the SUV with him to give him a little shade, pours windshield wiper fluid into his water bottle in case he gets desperate, brings his pocket knife in case he finds a cactus that looks like it might have water, and he heads out in the direction he thinks is correct. He walks for an entire day. By the end of the day, he's really thirsty. He's been sweating all day. His lips are starting to crack. He's reapplied sunblock twice. He's tried to stay under the umbrella, but he still feels sunburned. The windshield wiper fluid sloshing in the bottle in his pocket is getting really tempting now. He knows that it's mainly water and has some ethanol and coloring. He also knows that they add some kind of poison to keep people from drinking it. He wonders what the poison is and whether the poison would be worse than dying of thirst. He pushes on to try and get to that small town before dark. By the end of the day, he starts getting worried. He figured he's been walking at least 3 miles an hour, and according to his watch, for over 10 hours. That means if his estimate was right, he should be close to the town. But he doesn't recognize any of this. He had to cross a dry creek bed a mile or two back, and he doesn't remember coming through it in the SUV. He figures that maybe he got his direction off just a little, and the dry creek bed was just off to one side of the path. He tells himself that he's close, and that after dark he'll start seeing the town lights over one of the hills, and that'll be all he needs. As it gets dim enough, and he starts stumbling over small rocks and things, he finds a spot, and sits down and waits for it to get dark and find the town lights. Full dark comes before he knows it. He must have dozed off. He stands back up and turns all the way around, and he sees nothing but stars. He wakes up the next morning feeling absolutely lousy. His eyes are gummy, his mouth and nose feel like they're full of sand. He is so thirsty he can't even swallow. He barely got any sleep because it was so cold. He had forgotten how cold it got at night in the desert, and he hadn't noticed it the night before because he had been in his car. He knows the rule of threes: 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, and then you die. Some people can make it a little bit longer in the best of situations, but the desert heat and having to walk and sweat isn't the best of situation to be in without water. He figures unless he finds water, this is his last day. He rinses his mouth out with a little of the windshield wiper fluid. He waits a while after spitting it out to see if his mouth goes numb, that he feels dizzy or something. Has his mouth gone numb? Or is it just in his mind? He's not sure. He'll go a little farther to see if he doesn't find water. He'll try drinking some of the fluid. Then he has to face his next harder question. Which way does he go from here? Does he keep walking the same way he was yesterday, assuming he still knows which way that is? Or does he try a new direction? He has no idea what to do. Looking at the hills and dunes around him, he thinks that he knows the direction he was heading before. Just by going by a feeling, he points himself into what's somewhat of a left of that and starts walking. As he walks, the day starts heating up. The desert is too cold just a couple hours before and then soon becomes an oven again. He sweats a little at first and then stops. He's starting to get worried that when you stop sweating, he knows that means you're in trouble right before heat stroke. He decided it's time to take the windshield wiper fluid. Can't wait any longer. If he passes out, he's dead. If he stops in the shade of a large rock, takes the bottle out, opens it, takes a mouthful, and slowly swallows it, making it last as long as he can. It feels so good in his dry and cracked throat that he doesn't even care about the nasty taste. Takes another mouthful, makes it last too. Slowly he drinks half the bottle. He figures that since he's drinking it, he might as well drink enough to make some difference to keep himself from passing out. He's quit worrying about the denaturing of the wiper fluid. If it kills him, it kills him. If he didn't drink it, he'd die anyway. Besides, he's pretty sure that whatever substance they denature the fluid with is designed to make you sick. Their way of keeping winos from buying cheap wiper fluid for the ethanol content. He can handle throwing up if it comes to that. He walks and he walks in the hot, dry, windless desert. sand, rocks, hills, dunes, and the occasional scrawny cactus or dried brush. No sign of water. Sometimes he'll see a little movement to one side or the other, but whatever moved is usually gone before he can focus his eyes on it. Probably birds, lizards, or mice. Maybe snakes, though they usually move more at night. He's careful to stay away from the movements. After a while, he begins to stagger. He's not sure if it's fatigue, heat stroke, finally catching him, or maybe he was wrong about the denaturing of the wiper fluid, and that it was worse than he thought. He tries to steady himself and keep going. After more walking, he comes to a large stretch of sand. This is good. He knows he passed over that stretch of sand in the SUV. He remembers doing donuts in it, or at least he thinks he remembers it. He's getting woozy enough and tired enough that he's not sure what he remembers anymore, or if he's hallucinating, but he thinks he remembers it. So he heads off into it, trying to get to the other side, hoping that it gets him closer to the town. He was heading for a town, wasn't he? He thinks he was. He isn't sure anymore. He's not even sure how long it's been walking anymore. Is it still morning, or has it moved to afternoon? And is the sun going down again? It must be afternoon. It seems like it's been too long since he started out. He walks through the sand. After a while, he comes to a big dune in the sand. This is bad. He doesn't remember any dunes when driving over the sand in the SUV, or at least he thinks he doesn't remember there was any. This is bad. But he has no other direction to go. Too late to turn back now. He figures he'll get to the top of the dune and see if he can see anything from up there that'll help him find the town. He keeps going up the dune. Halfway up, he slips in bad footing off the sand. For the second or third time, he falls to his knees. He doesn't feel like getting back up. He just falls down again. So he keeps going up the dune on his hands and knees. While crawling, if his throat weren't so dry, he'd laugh. He'd finally gotten the hack-and-eyed image of a man lost in the desert, crawling through the sand on his hands and knees. It would be perfect images, if only his clothes were more ragged. The people crawling through the desert in cartoons always had ragged clothes, but his would have outlasted any rip so far. Somebody would probably find his desiccated corpse half buried in the sand years from now, and his clothes would still be in fine shape. Shake out the sand in a good wash, and they'll be wearable again. He wishes his throat were wet enough to laugh. He coughs a little instead, and it hurts. He finally makes it to the top of the sand dune. Now that he's at the top, he struggles a bit. He manages to stand up, look around, and all he sees is sand. Sand and more sand. Behind him, about a mile away, he thinks he sees the rocky ground that he left to head into the sand. Ahead of him, more dunes, more sand. This isn't where he drove his SUV. This is hell, or close enough. Again, he doesn't know what to do. He decides to drink the rest of the wiper fluid while figuring it out. Takes the bottle, removes the cap, and when he glances to the side, he sees something in the sand at the bottom of the dune off to the side. Something strange in a flat area in the sand. He stops taking the cap off the bottle and tries to look closer. The area seems to be circular. It's dark, darker than the sand, and there seems to be something in the middle of it, but he can't tell what it is. He looks as hard as he can and can still tell from here he's going to have to go down there and look. He puts the bottle back in his pocket. He starts to slowly stumble down the sand dune. After a few steps, he realizes that he's in trouble. He's not going to be able to keep his balance. After a couple more sliding, tottering steps, he falls and starts to roll down the dune. The sand is so hot when his body hits it. For that minute, he thinks he's caught on fire on the way down, like a movie car wreck flashing into flames as it goes over the cliff before it even hits the ground. He closes his eyes and his mouth, covers his face with his hands, and waits to stop rolling. He stops at the bottom. After a minute or two, he finds the energy to sit up and get the sand out of his face and off of his clothes. When he clears his eyes enough to look around to make sure that the dark spot in the sand is still there, and then he hadn't just imagined it. So, seeing the large, flat, dark spot on the sand is still there, he begins to crawl towards it. He'd get up and walk towards it, but he doesn't seem to have the energy to get up and walk right now. He must be in the final stages of dehydration, he figures, as he crawls. If this place in the sand doesn't have any water, he'll likely never make it anywhere else. This is his last chance. He gets closer and closer, but he still can't see what's in the middle of this dark area. His eyes won't quite focus on any more for some reason. Lifting his head up, he looks, takes so much effort trying, and he just gives up. He keeps crawling. Finally, he reaches the area he'd seen from the dune. It takes a couple of minutes of crawling before he realizes that it's no longer sand. He's now crawling on some sort of dark stone with some kind of marking on it, a pattern cut into the stone. He's too tired to try and stand up and see what the pattern is, so he just keeps crawling. Crawls towards the center where his blurry eyes still see something in the middle of the dark stone area. His mind detached in a strange way. Notes that Either of his hands and knees were so burnt by this thing they no longer felt pain, or this dark stone in the middle of the burning desert with a pounding, punishing sun overhead doesn't seem to be hot. It almost feels cool. He considers lying down on the nice, cool surface. Cool, dark stone. Not a good sign. He must be hallucinating. He's probably in the middle of a patch of sand already lying face down and dying, just imagining the whole thing, a desert mirage. Soon the beautiful women carrying pitchers of water will come up and start giving him a drink, and then he'll know he's gone. He decides to lay down against the cool stone. If he's going to die here in the middle of this hallucination, at least he'll want to see what's in the center before he keeps crawling. It's the third time that he hears a voice before he realizes what he's hearing. He would swear that someone just said, "Greetings, traveler. You do not well. Do you hear me?" He stops crawling, tries to look up from where he is on his hands and knees, but it's too much effort to lift his head. So he tries something different. He leans back and tries to sit up on the stone, but after a few seconds, he catches his balance and avoids falling on his face, sits up, and tries to focus his eyes. Blurry, he rubs them with the back of his hand again. Better this time. Yep, he can see it. He's sitting in the middle of a large, flat, dark expanse of stone. Directly next to him, about 3 feet away, is a white poster pole about 2 inches in diameter, sticking out about 4 or 5 feet out of the stone at an angle. And wrapped around this white rod, a tail with a rattle on it, hovering, seeming to be ready to strike. What must have been a 15-foot long desert diamondback rattlesnake looking back at him. He stares at the snake in shock. He doesn't have the energy to get up and run away. He doesn't even have the energy to crawl away. This is it. This is his final resting place. No matter what happens, he's not going to be able to move from this spot. Well, at least he's dying from a bite from this monster should be quicker than dying of thirst. He'll face his end like a man. He struggles to sit up a little straighter. The snake keeps watching him. He lifts one hand, waves it at the snake's direction feebly. The snake watches for a moment, and then goes back to watching the man, looking into his eyes. Huh. Maybe the snake had no interest in biting him. It hadn't rattled. That was a good sign. Maybe he wasn't going to die by snake bite after all. He then remembers that he looked up when he reached the center because he had thought he had heard a voice, still very woozy, likely to pass out soon. The sun beat down on him, even though he was now on a cool stone. He still didn't have anything to drink, but he had actually heard a voice. The stone didn't look natural, nor did that white post sticking up from the stone. Someone had to have built this. Maybe they were still nearby. Maybe that was who talked to him. Maybe the snake was their pet, and that's why it wasn't biting. He tries to clear his throat and say hello, but his throat is too dry. All that comes out is coughing, wheezing sound. There is no way he's going to be able to talk without something to drink. He feels his pocket with the bottle, the wiper fluid still in there. He shakily pulls the bottle out, almost losing his balance and falling back in the process. This isn't good. He doesn't have much time left by his reckoning before he passes out. He gets the lid off the bottle and manages to get the bottle to his lips. Pours some of the fluid into his mouth and then sloshes it around and swallows it. He coughs a little, but his throat feels better, and maybe he can talk now. He tries again, ignoring the snake. He turns to look around, hoping to spot the owner of this place, and croaks out, "Hello, is anyone there?" He hears from the side, "Greetings. What is it that you want?" He turns his head back towards the snake. That's where the sound had seemed to come from. The only thing that he can think of is there must be a speaker hidden under the snake, or maybe built into the post. He decides to try asking for help. "Please," he croaks again, feeling dizzy. "I'd love to not be thirsty anymore. I've been a long time without water. Can you help me?" Looking in the direction of the snake, hoping to see where the voice was coming from this time, he is shocked to see the snake rear back, open its mouth, and speak. He hears it say it as the dizziness overtakes him and he falls forward, face first on the stone. "Very well. Coming up." A piercing pain shoots through his shoulder. Suddenly he is awake. He sits up and grabs his shoulder, wincing at the throbbing pain. He is momentarily disoriented as he looks around, and then he remembers the crawl across the sand, the dark stone area, the snake. He sees the snake still wrapped around the tilted white post, still looking at him. He reaches up and feels his shoulder where it hurt. It's slightly wet. He pulls his finger away and looks at them. Blood. He feels his shoulder again. His shirt is what feels like two holes, two puncture holes that match up with the two aching spots on his shoulder. He had been bitten by the snake. "It'll feel better in a minute," he looks up. The snake talking. He hadn't dreamed it. Suddenly he notices he's not dizzy anymore. And more importantly, he's not thirsty at all. "Have I died? Is this the afterlife? Why are you biting me in the afterlife?" "Sorry about that. I had to bite you. That's the way I work. It all comes through the bite. Think of it as natural medicine. You bit me to help me. Why aren't I thirsty anymore? Did you give me a drink before you bit me? How did I drink while unconscious to not be thirsty anymore? I haven't had a drink in over 2 days. Well, except for the windshield wiper fluid. Hold it. How in the world does a snake talk? Are you real? Are you some sort of Disney animation? No, says the snake. I am real. As real as anyone is, anyway. I didn't give you a drink. I bit you. That's how it works. It's what I do. I bite. I don't have hands to give you a drink, even if I had water sitting around here. The man stunned for a minute. Here he was, sitting in the middle of the desert, some strange stone that should be hot, but it wasn't. Talking to a snake that could talk back, and it just bitten him, and he felt better. Not great. He was still starving, exhausted, but much better. He was no longer thirsty. He started to sweat again, but only slightly. He felt the hot sun. It was starting to get lower in the sky, but the cool stone beneath him was a relief. He could notice now that he was no longer dying of thirst. I might suggest that we take care of that methanol you have in your system with the next request, continued the snake. I can guess why you drank it, but I'm not sure how much you drank, or how much methanol was left in the wiper fluid. That stuff is nasty. It'll make you go blind in a day or two if you drink enough of it. Next request, said the man. He put his hands on his hurting shoulder, backed away from the snake a little. That's how it works, if you like, that is. You get 3 requests. Call them wishes if you wish. The snake grinned at his own joke. The man drew back a little further for the showing of his fangs. But there are rules, the snake continued. The first request is free. The second requires agency of secrecy. The third requires a binding of responsibility. The snake looks at the man seriously. By the way, the snake says suddenly, my name is Nathan. Old Nathan. Sammy used to call me. He gave me the name before that, but most of the bound just used to call me Snake. Then I got old. Sammy wouldn't stand for it. He said that anything I could talk needed a name. He is big into names. You can call me Nate if you wish. Again, the snake grinned. Sorry if I don't offer to shake, but I think you can understand. My shake sounds somewhat threatening. The snake gives a shake to his little rattle. My name is Jack, said the man, trying to absorb all of this. Jack Sampson. Can I ask you a question? Jack said suddenly. What happened to the poison in your bite? Why aren't I dying now? How did you do that? What do you mean by that's how you work? That's more than one question, grins Nate, but I'll still try to answer them. First, yes, you can ask me a question. Snake's grin gets wider. Second, the poison is in you. It's changed you. You no longer need to drink. That's what you asked for. Well, technically, you asked not to be thirsty anymore, but it's such a vague term. I decided to make it permanent. Now, as long as you live, you shouldn't need to drink much at all. Your body will conserve water very efficiently. You should be able to get just enough from the food you eat. Much like a creature of the desert, you have been changed. For the third question, Nate continues, you are still dying. Besides the effect of the methanol in your system, you're a man and men are moral. In your current state, I can give you no more than about another 50 years, assuming you get out of this desert alive. Nate seemed vastly amused by his own humor and continued with his wider grin. As for the fourth question, Nate said, looking more serious as far as Jack could tell, as Jack was now working on his ability to read the talking snake emotions from snake facial features. First, you have to agree to make a second request and become bound by the secrecy, or I can't tell you. Wait, joked Jack. Isn't this where you could tell me, but you would have to kill me? I thought that I thought that was implied. Nate continued to look seriously. Yeah. Jack leaned back a little as he remembered again that he was talking to a 15-foot poisonous reptile with a reputation for having a nasty temper. So this is bound secrecy stuff. Can you really stop the effects of the methanol? Jack stopped for a second. And what do you mean by methanol anyway? I thought they just use ethanol and wiper fluid just to denature it. They may. I really don't know. I haven't gotten out in a while. Maybe they do. All I know is that I smell methanol in your breath and that bottle in your pocket. The color is blue of the liquid that you pulled it out to drink some, and let me guess, it was wiper fluid. I assume they still use color wiper fluid blue. Yes, they do. I figured, replied Nate. As for being bound by secrecy, with the fulfillment of your next request, you'll be bound to say nothing about me, this place, or any of the information I will tell you after that. When you decide to go out with your kind, you won't be allowed to talk about me, write about me, use sign language, charades, or even act in a way that will lead someone to correctly guess about me. You will be bound to secrecy, of course. I will also ask you to promise not to give me away. As I am guessing you're a man of your word, you will never test the binding in any way, so you won't notice. Nate said the last part with utter confidence. Jack, who had always prided himself on being a man of his word, felt a little nervous at this. Hey, Nate, who are you? How did you know that? Are you omnipotent or something? Well, Jack, Nate sadly said, I can't tell you that unless you make the second request. Nate looked away for a minute and then looked back. Well, okay. What is this part about a second request? What can I ask for, and are you allowed to tell me that? Sure. You're allowed to ask for changes to yourself. They're like wishes, but they can only affect you. Oh, and before you ask, I cannot give you immortality, omnipotence, omnipresence, or for that matter. Though I might be able to make you gaseous and yet remain alive, you would spread through the atmosphere and be sort of omnipresent. But what good would that be? You still wouldn't be omnipotent and thus could only focus on one thing at a time. Not very useful, in my opinion. Nate stopped when he realized Jack was staring at him. Well, anyway, continued Nate, I probably suggest you giving me permanent good health. It would negate the methanol now in your system. You'd be immune to most poisons and disease, and you tend to live a very long time, barring accident, of course. You would even have a tendency to recover from accidents well. It always seemed like a good choice for a request to me. Cure the methanol poison, huh? And keep me healthy for a long time? Doesn't sound bad. And it has to be a request to change me. I can't ask to be rich, right? Because that's not really a change to me. Right. Could I ask to be a genius and permanently healthy? That takes two requests, Jack. Yeah, I figured so. But I could ask to be a genius and then become the smartest scientist of the world or the best athlete. Well, I could make you very smart, but that wouldn't necessarily make you the best scientist in the world. I can make you very athletic, but that wouldn't make you the best athlete. You've heard the saying that 99% of genius is hard work. Well, there's some truth to that. I can give you the talent, but I can't make you work hard. It all depends on what you decide to do with it. Huh, said Jack. Okay, I think I understand. And I get the third request after this one? Maybe. Depends on what you decide then. There are more rules for the third request, and I can only tell you about after the second request. You know how it goes. Nate looked like he'd shrug if he had shoulders. Well, since I'd rather not be blind in a day or two, and permanent health doesn't sound bad, consider that my second request, officially. Do I need to sign something in blood? No, said Nate. Just hold out your hand. Or heel. Nate grinned. Whatever part of you want me to bite. I have to bite you again. Like I said, that's how it works. The poison, you know, Nate said apologetically. Jack winced and he felt his shoulder where the last bite was. Hey, it didn't hurt anymore, just like Nate said. That made Jack feel better about the biting business, but still standing while 15 feet, while still standing while a 15-foot snake sunk its fangs into you. Jack stood up, ignoring how good it felt to be able to stand again and the hunger starting to gnaw at his stomach. Jack tried and decided to get where he wanted to get bit, despite knowing that it wouldn't hurt for long. Jack knew it wasn't going to be easy. Hey, Jack, Nate suddenly said, looking past Jack towards the dune. Is that someone else coming over there? Jack spun around and looked. Who else could it be in the middle of nowhere? And did they bring food? Wait a minute. There was nobody there. Well, it was Nate. Jack let out a bellow as he felt the two fangs sinking to his rear end through his jeans. Jack sat down carefully, favoring his more tender buttock. I would have decided eventually, Nate. I was just thinking about it. You didn't have to hoodwink me like that. I've been doing this a long time, Jack, Nate said confidently. You humans have a hard time sitting still and letting a snake bite you, especially one that's my size. And besides, admit it, it's only been a couple of minutes already, and it already doesn't hurt anymore. That's because the health benefit with this one. I told you that you'd heal quickly. Yeah, well, still. It's the principle of the thing. Nobody likes being bitten in the butt. Couldn't you have gotten my calf or something instead? More meat in the typical human butt, and less chance he'll accidentally kick me or move at the last second. Yeah, right. So tell me all these wonderful secrets I now qualify to hear. Okay, said Nate. You want to ask questions first, or you want me to just start talking? Just talk. I'll try to sit here and not think about food. We can go wrestle out some food first. Hey, you didn't tell me you had food around here. Jack jumped up. What do we have? Am I in walking distance of town, or can you magically whip up food along with your other powers? Jack almost shouting with excitement as his stomach had been growling for hours. I was thinking more like I could flush something out of its hole and bite it for you, and you could skin it and eat it. Assuming you have a knife, that is. Nate replied with a grin Jack was starting to get used to. Ugh, Jack said, sitting back down. I'll pass. I can last a little longer before I get desperate enough to eat desert rat or whatever else you is you find out here. And there's nothing to burn. I'd have to eat it raw. No thanks. Just talk. Okay, replied Nate, still grinning. But I'd better hurry before you start looking at me as food. Nate reared back a little, looked around for a second, then continued. Jack, you were sitting in the middle of the Garden of Eden. Jack looked around at the sand dunes and then looked back at Nate skeptically. Well, that's the best I can figure it anyway, Jack, said Nate. Stand up, look at the symbols on the rock here. Nate gestured around the dark stone they were both sitting on with his nose. Jack stood up and looked. Carved in the stone was a bas relief. It was a representation of a large tree. The angle of the pole Nate was wrapped around was coming out of the trunk, right below where the main branches had left the trunk to reach out across the stone. It was very well done. It looked more like a tree had been reduced to almost two dimensions and embedded in stone than it did a carving. Jack walked around and looked at the details in the fading light and the setting sun. He wished he looked at it when the sun was higher. Wait, the sun was setting. That means he was going to have to spend a night out here. Jack looked across the desert for a little bit and came back and stood next to Nate. In all the excitement, I almost forgot, Nate, said Jack. Which way is back to town? And how far? I'm eventually going to have to head back. I'm not sure if we'll be able to survive eating raw desert critters for long, and even if I can, I'm not sure that I want to. It's about 30 miles that way, Nate pointed with the rattle on his tail. As far as Jack could tell, it was the direction at the right angles that he had been going when he was crawling here. But that's 30 miles by the way the crow flies. It's about 40 miles if you walk. You should be able to do it in about a day and a half with your improved endurance. If you head out early tomorrow, Jack. Jack looked out the way the snake had pointed for a few more seconds and then sat back down. It was getting dark. Not much he could do about heading out right now. And besides, Nate was just about to get to the interesting stuff. Garden of Eden? As best as you can figure? Yeah, well, as best as I and Samuel could figure anyway. He figured that the story just got a little mixed up, snake in a tree, offering temptations, making bargains, that kind of stuff. But he never could quite figure out how the Hebrews found out about this spot from across the oceans. He worried about that for a while. Garden of Eden, huh? How long have you been here, Nate? No idea. A long time. Never occurred to me to count the years until recently, and by then, of course, it was too late. I do remember when this whole place was green, so I figured it had been about 1,000 years at least. Are you the snake that tempted Eve? Beats me, said Nate. I can't remember if the first one of your kind that I talked to was female or not. I never got a name, but it could have been. I suppose she could have been considered my offer to grant requests as the temptation, though I've rarely had refusals. Well, how did you get here then? And why is that white pole stuck out of the stone? Dad left me here. Or I assume it was my dad. It was another snake, much bigger than I was back then. I remember talking to him, but I don't remember if it was in a language or if just some kind of understanding of what he wanted. But one day he brought me to the stone, told me about it, asked me to do something for him. I talked it over with him for a while and then agreed. And I've been here ever since. What is this place? And what did he ask you to do? Well, you see this pole sticking out of the stone? Nate loosened his coils around the tilted white pole and showed Jack where it descended into the stone. The pole was tilted at a 45-degree angle. It seemed to enter the stone, an 18-inch slot cut into the stone. Jack leaned over and looked. The slot was dark and the pole went down as far as he could see in the dim light. Jack reached out to touch the pole, but suddenly Nate was in the way. You can't touch that yet, Jack. Why not? I haven't explained it to you yet. Well, it looks like a lever. You just push it that way and it moves into the slot. Yep, that's what it is. And what does it do? World? Oh no, said Nate. Nothing that drastic. It ends humanity. I call it the lever of doom. For the last few words, Nate had used a deeper, ringing voice. He tried to look serious for a few seconds and then gave up and grinned. Jack was initially startled by Nate's pronouncement, but when he grinned, Jack laughed and said, you almost had me fooled there for a second. What does it really do? Oh, it really ends humanity, like I said. I just thought the voice was funny. Didn't you? Nate continued to grin. A lever to end humanity. What in the world is that for? And why would anybody need to end humanity? Well, I get the idea that maybe humanity was an experiment. The big guy just thought if humanity started getting really bad, there should just be a way to end it. I'm not sure. All I know are the rules and the guesses that Samuel and I had about why it's here. I didn't really think to ask back when I started. Rules? What rules? The rules are that I can't tell anybody about them or let them touch it unless they agree to be bound by secrecy by a bite. And then only one human can be bound in that way at a time. That's it, explained Nate. Jack looked somewhat shocked. You mean I could pull the lever now and you'd let me end humanity? Yep, if you want to. Nate looked carefully at Jack. Do you want to, Jack? No. Stepping a little bit further back from the lever. Why in the world would anybody want to end humanity? It would take a psychotic to want to do that, or worse, suicidal psychotic. Because it would kill them too, wouldn't it? Yep, as being a human too. Has anyone ever considered it? Any of those bound to the secrecy, that is? Well, of course, I think they've all seriously considered it at one time or another. Being given that kind of responsibility really makes you sit down and think, or so I'm told. Samuel considered it several times. He'd often get disgusted with humanity, come out here and just hold the lever for a while, but he never pulled it, or you wouldn't be here. Jack sat down, well back from the lever. He looked thoughtful and puzzled at the same time. After a bit, he said, "So this makes me the judge of humanity. I get to decide whether they keep going or just end. Me." "That seems to be it," agreed Nate. "What kind of criteria do I use to decide? How do I make this decision? Am I supposed to decide if they're good, or are there too many bad? Or are they going the wrong way? Is there a set of rules for that?" "Nope," replied Nate. "You pretty much just have to decide on your own. It's up to you. However you want to decide it. I guess you're just supposed to know." "But what if I get mad at someone, or some girl dumps me and I feel horrible? Couldn't I make a mistake? How do I know I won't screw up?" protested Jack. Nate gave his kind of snake-like shrug again. "You don't. You just have to try your best, Jack." Jack sat there for a while, staring off into the desert, rapidly getting dark, chewing on a fingernail. Suddenly, Jack turned around and looked at the snake. "Nate, was Samuel the one bound before me?" "Yep, he was a good guy. Talked to me a lot, taught me to read, brought me books. I think I still have a good pile of them buried in the sand around here somewhere. I still miss him. He died a few months ago." "He sounds like a good guy. How did he handle this when you first told him? What did he do?" "Well," said Nate, "he sat down for a while, thought about it for a bit, and then asked me some questions, much like you're doing." "What did he ask you, if you're allowed to tell me?" "He asked me about the third request." "Ah, and what did you tell him?" "I told him the rules for the third request. To get to the third request, you have to agree to this whole thing. And if it ever comes to the point where you really think that humanity should be ended, you'll come out here and end it. You won't avoid it. You won't wimp out." Nate looked serious again. "You'll be bound to do it, Jack." "Hmm." Jack looked back out into the darkness for a while. Nate watched him, waiting. "Nate," continued Jack, "what did Samuel ask for with his third request?" Nate sounded like he was grinning again, and he replied also quietly, "Wisdom, Jack. He asked for wisdom as much as I could give him." "Okay." Jack suddenly standing up, facing away from Nate. "Give it to me." Nate looked at Jack's backside. "Give you what, Jack?" "Give me that wisdom. The same stuff Samuel asked for. If it helped him, maybe it'll help me too." Jack turned his head, looked back over his shoulder, and Nate. "It did help him, right?" "He said he did. But he seemed a little quieter afterwards, like he had a lot to think about." "Yeah, well, I can see that," Jack said. "So give it to me." Jack turned face away from Nate again, bent over and slightly tensed up. Nate watched Jack tense up with a little exasperation. If he bit Jack now, he'd likely jump out of his skin and maybe hurt them both. "You remember, you'll be bound to destroy humanity if it ever looks like it needs it, right, Jack?" Nate asked, shifting positions. Yeah, I got it," Jack replied, squeezing his eyes tightly shut and his body tensing, not noticing change in Nate's direction of voice. "And," continued Nate from his new position, "do you remember that you'll turn bright purple and grow big horns and extra eyes?" Yeah, hey, wait a minute," Jack said, opening his eyes, straining up and turning them purple. He didn't see Nate there. With the moonlight, Jack could only see the lever extended from its slot in the rock without the snake around it. He heard Jack from behind him. Nate said, "Just kidding," right before he felt the familiar piercing pain in this time in his other butt cheek. Jack sat at the edge of the dark stone, rapidly cooling air, his feet extending out into the stand. He stared out into the darkness, listening to the wind stir, occasionally rubbing his butt where he'd been recently bitten. Nate had left for a while. He'd come back with the desert rodent, a bulge somewhere in his middle. It was now wrapped back around a lever, his tongue flicking out into the desert air, the only sign that he was still awake. Occasionally, Jack, with his toes absent-mindedly digging through the sand while he thought, would ask Nate a question without turning around. "Nate, do accidents count?" Nate lifted his head a bit. "What do you mean, Jack?" Jack tilted his head back while he was looking at the stars. "You know, accident. Accidentally fall on the lever without meaning to. Does it still wipe out humanity?" "Yeah, I'm pretty sure it does, so I suggest you be very careful when you start feeling wobbly." A little while later, "Does it have to be me that pulls the lever?" asked Jack. "That's the rule, Jack. Nobody else can pull it." "No," Jack shook his head. "I mean, does it have to be my hand? Could I pull the lever with a rope tied around it, or push it with a stick, or throw a rock?" "Yeah, those should work. Though I'm not sure how complicated you could get." Samuel thought about building one of those kind of remote controls for once, but gave up. Everything he built would just be gone by the next sunrise. If it was touching the stone or over it, I told him in the past others had been bound, tried to bury the lever so they wouldn't be tempted, but every time the stones or sand or whatever would disappear. "Wow, cool." Jack leaned back until his elbows kept him off the stone. He looked up into the sky. Nate, how long did Samuel live? One of his wishes was for health too, right? Yes, replied Nate. He lived to be 167 years old, Jack. 167 years. Wow, that's almost 140 more years if I live as long. Do you know what he died of, Nate? He died of getting tired of living, Jack. Nate sounded somewhat sad. Jack turned his head to look at Nate in the starlight. Nate looked back. Sammy knew he wasn't going to be able to stay in society. He figured they'd eventually see him still alive and start questioning it. So he decided he would have to disappear after a while. He faked his death once, but changed his mind. He decided it was too early. He could stay for just a little while longer. He wasn't very fond of mankind, but he liked the attention most of the time anyway. His daughter and then his wife dying almost did him in, though. He didn't stay in society much longer after that. He eventually came out here to spend time talking with me. Thinking about pulling the lever a few months ago, he told me that he had just had enough and it was his time. And then he just died? Asked Jack. Nate shook his head a little. He made his fourth request. There's only one thing you can ask for from the fourth request: the last bite. After a bit, Nate continued. He told me that he was tired, and that was his time, and he reassured me that someone new would show up soon like they always had. After another pause, Nate finished. Samuel's body disappeared off the stone with the sunrise. Jack laid back down and looked up at the sky, leaving Nate alone with his memories. It was a long time until Jack's breathing evened out into sleep. Jack woke with the sunrise the next morning. It was a little chilled in the morning desert air, but overall he was feeling pretty good. Well, except for his stomach was grumbling, and he wasn't willing to eat raw desert rat. So after getting directions to town from Nate, making sure that he knew how to get back, and reassuring Nate that he'd be back soon, Jack started the long walk back to town. With his new health and Nate's good directions, he made it back easy. Jack caught a bus back to the city, showed up for work the next day, a little worse for wear, with a story about getting lost in the desert and walking back out. Within a couple of days, Jack had talked to a friend about getting a tow truck, going back out into the desert to fetch the SUV. They found it after a couple hours of searching, towed it back without incident. Jack was careful not to even look at the direction of Nate's lever, though their path didn't come as inside of it. Before the next weekend, Jack had gone to a couple of stores, including a bookstore, and had gotten his SUV back from the mechanic. Without warning to avoid any more joyriding into the desert, on Saturday, Jack headed back out to see Nate. Jack had parked a little way out of the small town near Nate, loaded up his backpack with camping gear and the things he was bringing for Nate, and then started walking. He figured that walking would leave the least trail, and he knew that while not many people camped in the desert, it wasn't unheard of and shouldn't really raise suspicions. Jack had bought more books for Nate, recent books, magazines, newspapers, and things that would catch Nate up on what's happening in the world. Others that were just good books to read. He had spent the weekend with Nate and then headed out again, telling it he'd be back soon. But he had some things to do first. Over 4 months later, Jack was back to see Nate. This time, he had brought a laptop with him, a specially modified laptop with a solar recharger, special filters to keep the sand out, and a satellite uplink and a keyboard with a joystick. Jack had hoped a 15-foot rattlesnake would be able to use, and it had been hacked not to give out his location to the satellite. After that, Jack could email Nate, keep in touch, but still visited with him fairly regularly, at least once or twice a year. After the first year, Jack quit his job. For some reason, with the wisdom he'd been giving and the knowledge that he could live for 150 years, working in a 9-to-5 job for somebody else didn't seem worthwhile anymore. Jack went back to school. Eventually, Jack started writing. Perhaps because of the wisdom, or perhaps because of his new perspective, he wrote well. People liked what he wrote, and he became well known for it. After a time, Jack bought an RV and started traveling around the country for book signings and readings. But he still remembered to drop by and visit Nate occasionally. On one of his visits, Nate seemed quieter than usual. Not that Nate had been a fountain of joy lately. Jack's best guess that Nate was still missing Samuel. Though Jack had tried, he still hadn't been able to replace Samuel in Nate's eyes. Nate had been getting quieter each visit, but on this visit, Nate didn't even speak when Jack walked up to the lever. He nodded at Jack and then went back to staring into the desert. Jack, respecting Nate's silence, sat down and waited. After a few minutes, Nate spoke. Jack, I have someone to introduce you to. Jack looked surprised. Introduce me to? Jack looked around and then carefully looked back at Nate. Is this something to do with the big guy? No, replied Nate. This is more personal. I want you to meet my son. Nate looked over to the nearest sand dune. Sammy. Jack watched. A 4-foot-long desert rattlesnake crawled out from behind the dune up to the stone base of the lever. Yo, Jack, said the new, much smaller snake. Yo, Sammy, replied Jack. Jack looked at Nate. Named after Samuel, I assume? Nate nodded. Jack, I've got a favor to ask. could you show Sammy around for me? Nate unwrapped himself from the lever, slithered over to the edge of the stone across the stands. When Samuel first told me about the world and brought me books and pictures, I wished that I could go see it. I wanted to see the great forests and canyons and cities and even the other deserts, to see if they felt and smelled the same. I want my son to have that chance to see the world before he becomes bound here like I have been. He's seen it in pictures on over that computer you brought, but I hear it's not the same. That being there is different, and I want him to have that. Can you do that for me, Jack? Jack nodded. This was obviously very important to Nate, and so Jack didn't even joke about taking a talking rattlesnake out to see the world. Yeah, I can do that for you, Nate. Is that all you need? Jack could sense there was something more. Nate looked at Sammy. Sammy looked at Nate for a second and said, "Oh yeah, I've got to go pack. I'll be back in a bit, Jack. It's nice to meet you." Sammy slithered away out of the dune, out of sight. Nate watched Sammy disappear and looked back at Jack. Jack, this is my first son, my first offspring. Through all the years, he didn't even want to know what it took for me to find a mate. Nate grinned. But anyway, I've had a son for a reason. I'm tired and I'm ready for it to be over and I need a replacement. Jack considered this for a minute. So you're ready to come see the world and you wanted him to watch the lever while you're gone? Nate shook his head. No, Jack. You're a better guesser than that. You've already figured it out that I'm bound here. There's only one way for me to leave, and I'm ready. It's my time to die. Jack looked more closely at Nate. He could tell that Nate had thought about this, probably for quite a while. Well, Jack had trouble imagining what it would be like to be as old as Nate, but Jack could already tell that in another 100 years or 200 years he might be getting tired of life himself. Jack could understand Samuel's decision, and now Nate's. So Jack said, "What do you want me to do?" Nate nodded. "Thanks, Jack. I only want two things. One, show Sammy the world. Let him get his fill of it until he's ready to come back here and take over. Two, give me the fourth request. I can't just decide to die, not any more than you can. I won't even die of old age like you eventually. Even though it'll be a long time from now, I need to be killed. Once Sammy is back here, ready to take over, I'll be ready to die, and you need to kill me. I've even thought about how. Poisons and other drugs won't work on me. I've seen pictures of snakes that were shot. Some of them lived for days, and that's out too. So I want you to bring back a sword." May turned away to look back at the dune Sammy had gone by. "I'd say an axe, but that's somewhat undignified, putting my head on the ground like a chopping block. No, a sword, a time-honored way of going out, a dignified way to die. And most importantly, it should work even on me. Are you willing to do that for me, Jack?" Nate turned to look at Jack. "Yes, Nate. I can handle it." "Good." He turned back towards the dune. "Sammy, Jack's about to leave." Then quietly, "Thank you, Jack." Jack didn't have anything to say. He waited for Sammy to make it back to the lever and nodded to him one final time. Nate then headed out into the desert with Sammy following. Over the next several years, Sammy and Jack kept in touch with Nate through emails as they went about their adventures. They made a goal of visiting every country in the world. They did a respectable job of it. Sammy had a natural gift for languages, as Jack expected he would. He even ended up as a translator for Jack in a few of the countries. Jack managed to keep his talking rattlesnake hidden, even though by the time they were nearing the end of their tour of countries, Sammy had only been spotted a few times. While there were several people that had seen enough to startle them greatly, nobody had any evidence to prove anything. And while a wild few rumors and stories followed Jack and Sammy around, nothing ever hit the newspapers or public in general. When they finished the tour of the countries, Jack suggested they try some undersea diving. They did, and spelunking. They did that too. Sammy finally drew a line at visiting Antarctica. He'd come to realize that Jack was stalling after talking to his dad about over email. He figured that Jack probably didn't want to have to kill Nate. Nate told Sammy that humans could be squeamish about killing friends and acquaintances. So eventually Sammy put his tail down, as he didn't have a foot, and told Jack that it was time. He was ready to go back and take up his duties for his dad. Jack delayed it a little bit more by insisting that they go back to Japan and buy an appropriate sword. He even stretched it a little bit more by getting lessons in how to use the sword, but eventually he learned as much as he was likely to learn without dedicating his life to it, and was definitely competent enough to take the head off a snake. It was time to head back and see Nate. When they got back to the U.S., Jack got the old RV out of storage where he and Sammy had left it after the tour of the States. He had loaded up Sammy and the sword, and they headed for the desert. When they got to the small town Jack had been trying to find all those years ago when he had met Nate, Jack was in a funk. He really didn't feel like walking all the way out there. Not only that, but he had forgotten to figure his travel time correctly, and it was late afternoon. They'd have to spend the night in town and walk out tomorrow or walk in the dark. As Jack was afraid if he waited one more night in the RV, he would lose his resolve. He decided to just go ahead and drive the RV out there. It's only going to be once, and Jack would go back and cover their tracks afterwards. They thought they might be able to make it out there by nightfall if they drove, and they could get it covered over tonight. Jack told Sammy to email Nate that they were coming as he drove out of sight of the town and the road, and he pulled off the road and headed into the desert. Everything went well until they got to the sand dunes. Jack had been nursing the RV along the whole time over the rocks through the creek beds, revving the engine a few times that it almost got stuck. When they came to the dunes, Jack didn't really think about it. He downshifted and headed up the first one, but by the third dune, Jack started to regret that he had decided driving on the sand and the RV was fishtailing and losing traction. Jack was having to work up to each dune slowly and was trying to keep them from losing control every time they came over the top and slid down the other side. Sammy had to come sit up in the passenger seat, coiled up and laughing at Jack's driving. As they came over the top of the fourth dune, which was the biggest one yet, Jack saw it was the final dune. The stone, the lever, Summers, Nate waited below. Jack put on the brakes, but he'd gone a little too far, and the RV started slipping over the other side. Jack tried turning the wheel, but didn't have enough traction. He pumped the brakes, no response. They started sliding down over the hill faster and faster. Jack felt a shock go through him as he suddenly realized they were heading for the lever. He looked down. The RV was on direct course for it. If Jack didn't do something, he would hit it. He was about to hand humanity. Jack steered more frantically, trying to get traction, but it wasn't working. The dune was too steep and the sand too loose. In a split second, Jack realized his only chance would be to hit the stone and go around the lever, as he should have traction on the stone just a second before he hit the lever, but he wouldn't have time enough to stop. He should be able to steer the RV away. Jack took a better grip on the steering wheel and tried to turn the RV just a little bit. Every little bit would help, but he'd have to time his turn just right. As the RV got to the bottom of the dune, sliding at an amazing speed in the sand, just before they reached the stone, Jack looked across to check to see if they were still heading for the lever. They were, but Jack noticed something else, something he hadn't seen from the top of the dune. Nate wasn't wrapped around the lever. He was off to the side of the lever on the stone, still waiting for them. The problem was that he was
The
waiting
RV
on the
was
same
already
side of the
starting to
lever
drift
Jack
that
had
way.
to steer towards to avoid it. The RV was already starting to drift that way, and it was in a mad rush across the sand. There was no way Jack was going to be able to go around the lever to the other side. Jack had an instant realization. He was either going to hit the lever or run over Nate. He glanced over at Sammy, and Sammy saw the realization of the same thing. Jack took a firmer grip of the steering wheel as the RV ran up the stone, shouting to Sammy as he pulled the wheel, "Well, better Nate than lever," and he ran over the snake.